Imagine stepping into a machine that feels less like a car and more like a promise. Smooth surfaces glowing with calm light. Doors that open like wings to a quiet sanctuary where the world outside becomes optional. Picture gliding through a city that almost parts for you, where the act of driving dissolves into the act of simply being. No roar, no rush, just motion made effortless, intelligence wrapped in luxury. It's the kind of vision that blurs the line between transportation and experience, daring us to ask whether the future of mobility is about moving faster or feeling freer. Because somewhere between today's traffic jams and tomorrow's autonomy lies a glimpse of how we might live, connect, and travel without ever touching the wheel again. And when one company unveiled its silver capsule of the future, it wasn't just a car, it was a statement about what comes next. If you're into design that challenges convention and tech that redefines comfort, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment on what automotive future you want to see next. The Mercedes F-015. Luxury in Motion began not as a production project, but as a manifesto, an audacious concept unveiled in 2015 to redefine what a car could mean when human hands no longer controlled it. At first glance, the F-015 looked like something borrowed from a science fiction film. Polished silver skin stretched over a sculpted pod, its proportions strange yet mesmerizing, the silhouette impossibly smooth. But beneath that futuristic shell was a calculated statement from Mercedes-Benz. The belief that luxury would soon be measured not by horsepower or chrome, but by freedom from effort. In the mid-2010s, the automotive world was caught between two revolutions: electric mobility on one side, autonomy on the other. Every brand was talking about the future, but few dared to imagine what life inside that future might feel like. The F-015 aimed to do exactly that. Mercedes engineers and designers started with a radical question. What happens when the driver becomes a passenger? The answer shaped everything. From the elongated cabin to the massive 10-foot wheelbase, from the seamless panels to the way the car interacted with its environment. The design language told a story of serenity and control. The surfaces were meant to evoke trust. There were no sharp lines, no aggressive edges, just an elegant cocoon promising a new relationship between man and machine. Inside, that philosophy became literal. The F-015's cabin wasn't a cockpit, it was a lounge. 4 rotating chairs faced each other, wrapped in white leather and aluminum. Massive OLED touchscreens lined the doors, responding to gesture and voice commands. Step inside and you didn't see gauges or pedals. You saw a space meant for conversation, work, or quiet observation. Even the lighting changed dynamically, shifting tone to reflect the car's driving mode or external conditions. The F-015 was designed as a mobile living space, a phrase Mercedes repeated deliberately. The team knew that when driving ceased to be an active task, the emotional core of the car had to shift. The vehicle itself became an extension of the home and office, a private refuge moving through public space. That shift wasn't just aesthetic, it was deeply cultural. Mercedes-Benz, known for building symbols of executive control, was proposing something subversive: surrender. Yet it wasn't framed as loss, it was an elevation. The F-015 offered a vision of time reclaimed, of stress replaced by serenity. For engineers, this created immense challenges. How do you design a machine that inspires trust when it takes away your agency? Every element of the F-015 was crafted to answer that question. The car's human-to-machine interface was designed to feel intuitive, not imposing. When it drove autonomously, external LED strips communicated intentions to pedestrians. Blue lights signaling "I see you," white pulses showing direction of movement. It was the automotive equivalent of eye contact. This was subtle, deliberate, and crucial. Mercedes wanted the world to understand that safety and communication could coexist without a driver at the helm. Underneath, the F-015 used a hydrogen fuel cell hybrid system, part electric, part hydrogen-powered, capable of around 1,100 kilometers of theoretical range. That was impressive on paper, but the point wasn't raw performance. The powertrain symbolized sustainability, another pillar of the luxury in motion philosophy. The F-015 structure used carbon fiber reinforced plastic, aluminum, and steel to create a lightweight yet safe body, strong enough to protect, light enough to glide silently. The overall impression was eerie yet inviting, a vehicle alive with quiet intelligence. The debut at CES 2015 was carefully orchestrated. Mercedes didn't present it as a prototype, they presented it as a preview of civilization itself. The car drove autonomously onto the stage, doors opening in a theatrical arc, interior glowing like a high-end lounge. The reaction was instant and polarized. Some saw it as a triumph of design foresight. Others called it a fantasy detached from real-world mobility. But Mercedes wasn't after applause, it wanted provocation. The company's message was simple: the future isn't waiting for permission. Within the automotive world, the F-015 represented a philosophical pivot. Mercedes had always been about control. Control of engineering, of prestige, of the road. Now it was talking about the absence of control as luxury. That concept resonated far beyond car shows. It entered design schools, tech conferences, and policy debates. The idea that a vehicle could become an autonomous social capsule, a third space between home and destination, challenged the very structure of urban life. Still, not everything about the F-015 was fantasy. Many of its technologies quietly informed the brand's future interiors. The multi-screen interfaces, the ambient design, the seamless digital physical transitions. Even the lighting language would echo in later models. The F-015 was never meant to sell units. It was meant to sell imagination. And imagination, when backed by Mercedes' engineering credibility, carries weight. Owners of traditional Mercedes sedans looked at it with fascination, maybe skepticism, but even they could see hints of what might trickle down. The S-Class had always been a testing ground for innovation. Now the F-015 showed what might happen when the S-Class outgrew the steering wheel entirely. In retrospect, Segment 1's story of the Mercedes F-015 luxury in motion isn't just about a concept car. It's about the moment a century-old automaker admitted that progress means letting go of the wheel. The next part of the story digs deeper. How this shimmering vision met the messy reality of markets, regulation, and public trust, and what that collision revealed about the road ahead. When the Mercedes F-015 luxury in motion left the stage lights of CES and entered public roads for limited testing, it became something more than a design statement. It became a case study in how society reacts to autonomy. Mercedes arranged controlled drives around California, letting journalists and technologists experience the eerie calm of a car that steered, braked, and accelerated on its own. For many, the quiet was unsettling. There were no vibrations, no steering corrections, no sense of input, just seamless movement through real traffic. In those moments, the F-015 revealed the emotional gap between technological ability and human readiness. People trusted their phones with private data, but trusting a machine with life and motion was a different leap. Yet Mercedes persisted, emphasizing that the F-015 wasn't about surrendering control. It was about redefining how control feels. The company positioned it as a research vessel, testing how humans and machines could communicate. Those glowing exterior lights, for example, weren't decoration, they were conversation. The F-015 projected pedestrian crosswalk signals and visual cues to show intent, pioneering the visual language of self-driving communication that would later inform many prototype fleets from other automakers and tech startups. The car could recognize a pedestrian, stop, and project a virtual zebra crossing onto the pavement, inviting them to walk. In that sense, the F-015 was an ambassador between the human era of driving and the algorithmic one. But beyond the poetic imagery, the economics were daunting. The technology required vast computing power, expensive sensors, and redundant systems that made the idea of mass production unrealistic in 2015. Mercedes engineers knew it, and they weren't trying to hide it. The F-015 existed in the same space as the Concorde, technically possible, financially improbable. Meanwhile, rivals and startups began chasing autonomy from different angles. Some promised full self-driving within a few years, focusing on data-driven learning rather than luxury experience. Others, particularly in Silicon Valley, saw the car not as a product but as a platform, a moving node for digital ecosystems. Against that backdrop, the Mercedes F-015 seemed almost philosophical. It wasn't promising autonomy tomorrow. It was asking what we wanted from it once it arrived. That difference in tone separated it from the hype cycle. The F-015 was a provocation, not a prophecy. The media dubbed it everything from a dream pod to a rolling lounge, but what lingered was its central question. When machines become chauffeurs, what happens to identity, to prestige, to the joy of driving? For Mercedes, the answer lay in doubling down on experience. The brand reframed luxury around the idea of quality of time. It meant comfort not as cushioning, but as liberation. Time to think, connect, or simply exist without tension. That principle would ripple through later Mercedes interiors, where digital minimalism replaced traditional opulence. The F-015's visual calm became the template for future dashboards. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Purists argued that removing the driver stripped cars of their soul. Legislators worried about accountability. If an autonomous Mercedes hit something, who was responsible? The public, still haunted by early self-driving mishaps elsewhere, hesitated to trust the unseen logic of algorithms. Mercedes understood that. They weren't rushing to market with an unfinished promise. Instead, they used the F-015 to gather insight, data, and emotional responses. Every feedback session informed how the brand approached automation in production cars, incrementally, carefully, with an emphasis on assisted rather than fully autonomous systems. In that sense, the F-015's influence can be felt today in features like adaptive cruise control, automated lane changes, and predictive safety systems. What was once science fiction became safety tech. But beyond technology, the F-015 also challenged city planners and policy thinkers. If vehicles like this became common, urban design would need to change. Roads, parking, even building entrances. A self-driving car that could drop you off and park itself elsewhere rewrote assumptions about ownership and use. Mercedes held workshops with architects and mobility researchers, exploring how infrastructure might adapt. In their vision, the F-015 wasn't just a car. It was part of a seamless network of autonomous pods, reshaping how cities breathe. It was aspirational, maybe utopian, but it started a conversation that still resonates in urban planning circles. The contrast between that vision and the automotive reality of the 2010s was striking. Gas prices fluctuated, SUVs dominated sales charts, and autonomy was still in its infancy. Yet here was a century-old brand talking about cars as digital sanctuaries. The juxtaposition was deliberate. Mercedes wasn't trying to predict the next product. It was safeguarding its identity in a post-driving world. If people stopped buying cars for performance or ownership pride, they'd still crave design, safety, and comfort. The F-015's job was to make sure those values remained synonymous with Mercedes-Benz. Over time, the F-015 became a symbol more than a prototype, a recurring reference point in interviews, a shorthand for futuristic credibility. It showed up in documentaries, design exhibitions, and think pieces about automation ethics. Its aesthetic, a mix of chrome serenity and digital intelligence, became visual shorthand for the car of tomorrow. Yet, underneath the polish, the deeper story was about humility. For all its grandeur, the F-015 admitted something profound. Technology moves faster than trust. Mercedes could build a car that drove itself, but not a world ready to accept it. That gap defined the second chapter of its legacy. As the years passed, other players entered the stage with their own autonomous experiments. Some focused purely on data and AI, others on affordability or scalability. None matched the F-015's theatrical sense of presence. The Mercedes vision was less about traffic efficiency and more about emotional clarity. A world where the automobile returns time to its passengers, where tranquility replaces tension. Even critics who dismissed it as unrealistic later acknowledged its cultural weight. By daring to make autonomy beautiful, Mercedes reframed how people imagine the future of transport. The F-015 story didn't end with production. It evolved into influence. The next step of the story explores what all this vision meant for the brand's future and the wider landscape of mobility. How a single silver concept still shapes how we think about driving, or not driving today. The Mercedes F-015 Luxury in Motion remains one of the most thought-provoking concept cars of the 21st century because it dared to ask not just what's possible, but what's desirable. A decade later, as the automotive world edges closer to autonomy, the F-015 looks less like a fantasy and more like a field guide to what's unfolding. When Mercedes-Benz designed it, the goal wasn't to build a product, it was to create a conversation. And that conversation continues to echo through the brand's latest vehicles. Look closely at the MBUX Hyperscreen, the ambient lighting systems, or the increasingly seamless driver assistance modes. Each bears the fingerprint of lessons learned from the F-015. This was the first Mercedes that didn't define luxury through driving pleasure. It defined it through presence. In the F-015, the calmness of the cabin was the performance metric. Every inch of design emphasized serenity, spatial awareness, and digital intuition, concepts that now anchor Mercedes's design DNA. Yet the F-015's legacy isn't confined to technology. It's about a philosophical pivot, one that reimagines what it means to own, to travel, and to feel safe in motion. For over a century, Mercedes built its reputation on mastery of control. The F-015 reversed that narrative by showing mastery of release. It taught the brand and its audience that comfort can mean trusting the unseen, and that innovation isn't just horsepower and torque, but emotional intelligence embedded in steel and code. In the years following its debut, that lesson rippled across industries. Airlines, hotel designers, and even smart home engineers referenced the F-015's interior as a benchmark for spatial calm. Its symmetry, lighting choreography, and use of materials like white leather and brushed aluminum became part of a new design vernacular, one that prioritized mental ease in technological spaces. Even more tellingly, the F-015 helped demystify automation for consumers. By wrapping the idea of autonomy in beauty and comfort, Mercedes humanized it. The car didn't look robotic or intimidating, it looked inviting. That aesthetic choice carried consequences far beyond marketing. It shifted the emotional context of the self-driving conversation from fear of loss to curiosity about gain. The F-015 became a visual metaphor for coexistence, human and machine in harmony. Of course, time adds perspective. As autonomous driving technology advanced, the world saw both promise and peril, triumphs in controlled testing, tragedies in imperfect execution. Through it all, the F-015 remained an ideal rather than a product, untainted by failure because it never overpromised. It continues to exist as a kind of North Star for how automation should feel: graceful, considered, responsible. Mercedes engineers refer to it as a philosophical testbed, a space to imagine the ethics of autonomy alongside its mechanics. That duality, engineering and empathy, became the hallmark of Mercedes's later innovations. Even as competitors pursued data-first approaches, Mercedes kept framing automation as a luxury experience built on trust. And that trust, fragile as it is, defines the next era of mobility. The F-015 also influenced how Mercedes markets its future. Instead of predicting a deadline for full autonomy, the company shifted to gradual integration, stepwise automation that builds confidence one feature at a time. The F-015 showed that you can't force the future into existence. You have to earn it. By giving people a tangible glimpse of what a driverless tomorrow might feel like, Mercedes planted the emotional seed that's now blossoming into mainstream acceptance. It's also worth noting how the F-015 reframed the car as a social object. Traditionally, luxury sedans represented status through isolation, the driver separated from the world, sealed in noise insulation and tinted glass. The F-015 flipped that narrative. Its translucent panels and interactive exterior displays reintroduced transparency and communication, suggesting that safety and autonomous mobility depends on visibility and empathy, not isolation. It wasn't just about shielding passengers from the world. It was about connecting them to it in smarter, safer ways. The legacy of that thinking appears in modern Mercedes safety systems that use predictive lighting, external signals, and AI-driven assistance to make roads more conversational environments. The influence extends beyond cars too. The F-015 became a museum piece, a teaching tool, a reference model for industrial design programs studying the intersection of ergonomics and emotion. In exhibitions, it stands as a reminder of a pivotal moment when the auto industry looked forward not with fear, but with imagination. What keeps it relevant today is how its questions still feel urgent. What do we do with our time when cars drive themselves? How do we measure luxury when every vehicle moves at the same effortless pace? Who holds responsibility when algorithms make choices in motion? These aren't just engineering puzzles, they're societal ones. And by putting them inside something beautiful, Mercedes ensured people actually wanted to ask them. That is the enduring genius of the F-015. The vehicle didn't predict the future, it invited us to design it. Even now, as Level 3 autonomy trickles into select markets, the F-015 stands apart as the purest articulation of what autonomous luxury could be if approached with patience, art, and respect for human experience. In a world racing toward efficiency, it reminded everyone that progress without grace isn't luxury, it's noise. And so, while the F-015 never reached production lines, it reached something more lasting, the collective imagination. The next and final chapter reflects on what this means for today's car buyers, enthusiasts, and the American audience how the legacy of the Mercedes F-015 luxury in motion shapes what we drive and expect right now. For American audiences, the legacy of the Mercedes F-015 luxury in motion feels both distant and immediate. Distant because the car itself never entered production. Immediate because its fingerprints are on nearly every modern Mercedes you can buy today. The seamless screens, ambient light signatures, and increasingly intuitive driver assist systems trace a lineage back to that silver capsule of the future. What once looked like fantasy now reads as foreshadowing. For buyers, that means the ideas first explored in the F-015, autonomy, sustainability, digital serenity, are no longer locked in concept form. They're arriving piece by piece. But understanding the F-015 today also means understanding its limits. It wasn't about price tags or horsepower. It was about perspective. Mercedes didn't build it to sell cars. It built it to ask questions. For US drivers who prize independence and control, that question still lingers. When the machine can handle everything, what part of driving remains yours? In practice, the F-015 spirit lives through technologies like Drive Pilot, which allows conditional autonomy on certain highways. It's a cautious but clear step toward the vision Mercedes first staged a decade ago. Unlike some competitors that overpromised and stumbled, Mercedes kept the pace deliberate, ensuring that when the wheel finally disappears, the trust won't. That's a uniquely Mercedes approach to innovation: slow, elegant, and deeply human. For those hoping to see an F-015 on the road, the reality is simpler. The concept itself will remain a museum piece, but its DNA runs through the lineup. The ethos of luxury in motion evolved into sensual purity and then into digital luxury, a continuum that defines every modern Mercedes sedan and SUV. The materials, the lighting logic, the sense that technology should soothe rather than shout, all of it began with the F-015. For enthusiasts, the takeaway is both pragmatic and poetic. The F-015 proved that car design can shape culture even without production, that ideas, when clear enough, outlive their physical forms. It also taught the industry that innovation must feel safe before it feels fast. For everyday buyers, its influence means the next generation of Mercedes vehicles will continue to blur lines between home, office, and road, vehicles that think ahead, communicate clearly, and turn motion into mindfulness. In terms of ownership, the F-015's promise of autonomous luxury isn't fully here yet, but the infrastructure is building. Regulations in states like California and Nevada already allow testing of higher-level autonomy, and Mercedes has become the first automaker to secure approval for certain hands-free systems under US law. The path from concept to consumer is slow, but it's steady. Pricing, availability, and reliability will always matter more than spectacle, and Mercedes knows it. The F-015 wasn't about a product, it was about trust. And trust, once earned, lasts longer than hype. In the end, the story of the Mercedes F-015 luxury in motion is a story about patience, about how a century-old automaker looked beyond speed and style to explore serenity and time. It reminds us that innovation isn't just about going farther, but about going wiser. In a landscape crowded with noise and competition, the F-015 stands as proof that the future can still feel quiet, deliberate, and beautifully human. The car may never have hit the streets, but its shadow stretches across every road we drive today. And that perhaps was the point all along.